Have you ever had to decide something where there is no clear winner, where doing the right thing hurts and you know someone is going to get hurt? That happened to me, Monique Harris, a judge in Chicago, and I still carry that verdict stuck in my mind. Imagine a civil trial where every witness, every word, shook me more than the last. It wasn't just law, it was real life. I had to choose between the cold letter of the law and compassion for the people in front of me, knowing that either option would cause harm. That's how complicated that day was. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The case seemed simple at first, a disagreement between two neighbors over a piece of land. But as I listened, I realized there were stories behind it that not even the law could easily interfere with. A family fighting for their home, and on the other side someone trying to protect what they believed was right. Testimonies that questioned not only facts but intentions, emotions, and fears. I held in my hands a decision that was legally clear but morally dark. How do you balance rules and humanity? What weighs more, justice or mercy? That verdict was the line where both collided. Every time I thought about delivering it, I felt like I was betraying someone. In the end, I gave the verdict the law demanded, but I knew it wasn't the whole truth, that someone's heart would be broken. And no, it wasn't because I didn't want to be fair, but because real life is not black or white. Months later, the case was still on my mind. Not as a closed file, but as a reminder of how complex it is to be a judge. Since then, I never decide solely with the law in mind. There's always that double awareness, what the law says and what people feel. And here comes the most important part. What's just doesn't always heal, nor is what's legal always what you and I would call fair on a human level. And there's no manual that teaches you how to deal with that guilt or burden. Now tell me, how would you decide if the law and compassion contradict each other? Because believe me, on that bench you feel crushed between those two forces, without a break. Have you ever felt that? Tell me in the comments. This was my most unforgettable case, and I know every judge experiences it differently. But for me, it was proof that being fair is not just about applying rules, but understanding what lies behind each story, no matter how complicated it is. Do you think I was right, or would you have leaned toward a different decision? Share your opinion, and let's talk about what it really means to judge. I only want the content of the text translated, without any explanation or indication. That morning in the courtroom, the air felt heavy, as if the story about to be told fogged every corner of the room. This was no ordinary case. I knew, from the very first moment I entered, that something in this civil dispute went beyond the usual boundaries of a mere monetary or contractual conflict. There were tired faces, gazes that sought not only justice, but perhaps comfort or even redemption. During the weeks leading up to the trial, I had read the pages of the case file one by one, but nothing, not even the most meticulous document, captured the true essence of what was at stake. The witnesses began to parade in like a slow but constant procession of half-truths, fragmented memories, emotions laid bare. Some came with weathered skin, wrinkles that seemed like maps of a hard life, others, with that youthful look that always makes you wonder if they were pushed into adulthood and the cruelty of legal conflicts too soon. Each testimony opened an invisible wound that no one expected to see in a room filled with benches, official microphones, and files locked tight. The truth, as usual, proved elusive, multiplied into opposing angles, and more than that, human, deeply human, in its contradictions and layers of misunderstood pain. I remember a woman who spoke with a trembling voice, but with a firmness that surprised the court. Something in her story stirred me from the very first word. She wasn't just a niece suing her uncle over an inheritance. There was a history of abandonment, of silences, of years in which the family blurred amid omissions and resentments. Her eyes, tarnished by fatigue and hopelessness, seemed to want to break down all the walls of the law to reach that other space where affection might still exist. In contrast, the accused man appeared reserved, with closed body language, but not without a hidden vulnerability. His defense was legally solid, no doubt, but again, something in his posture spoke of remorse, of an internal struggle that no statute could record. As I listened to their testimonies, I felt how that abyss between words and emotions grew larger and larger. It was as if the law existed to punish only what was visible, what could be proven, while true justice, the kind that should heal, remained stubbornly out of reach. One night, reviewing notes and observations, I understood that the verdict I had to deliver not only put properties or financial compensations at stake, but destinies, lives that would change forever depending on a cold letter in a legal text. The process dragged on, and the debates in court became more intense, not only because of the quality of the evidence, but because of what I myself began to feel. There was an invisible weight on my shoulders that I could neither delegate nor justify with legal arguments. Empathy began to sketch its unsettling outline behind duty. At one point, an unexpected statement came from one of the witnesses, someone who until then had seemed secondary. That person confessed details that gave the case a radical turn, evidence of prior agreements no one had presented, hidden motives explaining deep wounds and mistaken, but human decisions. With that new twist, the scale began to tip toward a much more uncertain ground, where the rigidity of the law gave way to the complexity of reality. It was as if every word spoken served to open a window onto the imperfections of judicial systems, a system that seeks certainties but rarely can embrace the complexity of the human being. In the following days, it became clear that the verdict was not only a matter of legal justice, but a delicate balancing act between reason and compassion. Compassion that, at many moments, I feared might compromise my impartiality, and reason that reminded me that the ruling had to be fair, well-founded, and irrevocable. The private deliberations were tormenting. Every time I reviewed a testimony, a phrase, an emotion captured in the room, I felt how the sentence blurred into an ethical dilemma that went beyond written law. At my desk, under the dim light, I faced the magnitude of my responsibility. I had to decide not only on facts, but on lives that could never be the same again. Time seemed to have slowed, and I was the only one holding the scales. That night, indecision weighed on me more than ever. I thought about every person involved, their stories, their struggles, their silences. I thought particularly about the invisible consequences of my decision, about what no one would say in public, the pain, the remorse, the fear of the future. I wondered if justice in its purest form could really exist without a human dose of forgiveness or understanding. It was then that I realized something crucial, that in my role, beyond legal duty, I had to make room for humanity, that which is not written in laws, but is the true fabric of our coexistence. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. I entered the room with a tight heart, aware that those few words spoken would resonate in lives forever. However, as I pronounced my sentence, a silent murmur spread among those present. The decision was legally correct, but also left room for hope, for repair beyond economic or punitive measures. I presented complementary measures that invited the protagonists to reunite, to dialogue, to rebuild the bond that time and distance had destroyed. The eyes of the woman who had testified with such passion shone with tears that were not just of sadness, but of recognition. The accused man lowered his gaze, and I could feel that, at that moment, something inside him was released, perhaps not from guilt, but from the unbearable burden of isolation. Upon leaving the room, a strange mix of relief and concern accompanied me. I knew my sentence had not closed the book, rather, it had opened a new chapter, full of uncertainty, but also possibility. The following months were a personal challenge. At every subsequent hearing, in every ruling, I carried with me that double awareness. I learned that justice sometimes requires more than codes. It demands listening with the heart, understanding the invisible root of pain, and having the courage to face the ethical consequences of our decisions. That ruling became a permanent lesson, a reminder that on the scale of life, reason and compassion must weigh equally. Sometimes, when I close my eyes before sleeping, I relive that cascade of testimonies and the silence that followed my verdict. I wonder what became of them, how they faced the open wounds, and if they were able to find some peace. I know I will never know for sure, which is the most unsettling paradox of my job. Justice can decree the end of a trial, but not the suffering nor the hope of those who live it. The truth is that since that case, Every time I sit on the bench, I listen not only to the lawyers or the witnesses, but also to that invisible part of humanity that lurks behind every word spoken. My most unforgettable ruling taught me that the law can and must coexist with compassion, even though this coexistence is not easy. And although I know not all decisions can fit into this dual form of truth, since then I have at least tried to seek it, with patience and with the hope that in the just balance between reason and heart, we find a justice that is more humane, profound, and perhaps more real. The days following the ruling were more difficult than I had expected. The courtroom, which for weeks had been filled with voices, tensions, and gazes seeking a definitive answer from me, now seemed like an empty, cold, and silent space. However, the reality of that decision was only beginning to unfold its consequences in the lives of those who had experienced it from within and in myself. During those weeks, I felt an almost physical weight, a kind of burden that I did not know whether it was responsibility or perhaps a longing I could not define. At night, when I tried to disconnect from the case, the image of their faces, that woman with tired yet hopeful eyes, the man with a withdrawn posture, and that unexpected witness who had changed the whole course, haunted me with an almost obsessive insistence. I couldn't stop wondering if what I had ruled would solve anything, or if rather it had ignited a spark on such fragile ground that it would soon forget how to extinguish it. Legal justice had been delivered. The assets were allocated, compensations were established, and clear guidelines were set so that both parties could move forward. But it had left the door open for an encounter that transcended the legal realm, something the law did not regulate, but which I knew, by the nature of humanity, was vital. It was then that I felt compelled to closely follow the developments after the verdict. Not officially, but as a personal act, almost a necessity to understand to what extent my decision influenced that web of intertwined lives, wounds, and possible reconciliations. I began to receive, through third parties, small echoes of what was happening outside, tense meetings, difficult conversations, but also shy gestures that perhaps, over time, could be keys to something different. I remember one afternoon when, almost without thinking, I found myself face to face with that woman who had once entered the courtroom with a broken but firm voice. Her eyes still bore the mark of exhaustion, but there was something in them that caught my attention, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that no sentence could erase. She spoke to me sincerely, as if in that meeting we could share more than words, as if between judge and party an unexpected channel opened where the legal and the human tried to meet. She told me that although the path was uncertain and each step was laden with fear, she felt something had changed. That for the first time, the idea of rebuilding the family bond ceased to be a mirage and became a horizon. At the same time, through third-party accounts, I learned that the accused man was also living an internal battle that seemed dark and lonely. The words of remorse I had heard during the trial now seemed to find echo in small daily acts, in gestures seeking to repair, albeit sometimes in a clumsy and imperfect way. I saw in him the fragility of one who carries a weight that the law can recognize, but not heal. In his silences I discovered, perhaps, the need for a compassion that goes beyond the sentence, one that only humanity can offer. These stories, in turn, led me to reflect on my own role in that whole framework. Justice, which in theory should be a cold and rational act, began to show its multiple, sometimes contradictory face. I had delivered a legally correct verdict on paper, but deep down I knew there was no final point, only a continuation that no courtroom could contain. In those days I understood that the true judgment did not end with a sentence, but extended to every decision made by those beings and, strangely, within myself. I especially remember one night when, after an exhausting day, I sat alone in my office with the dim light barely illuminating the papers on my desk. I tried to disconnect, but my mind kept returning to that case. I thought about justice and asked myself if I had enough courage to accept that legal solutions cannot always heal the deep wounds carried by people. My own heart beat with the reality that sometimes duty and compassion do not walk hand in hand, but face each other in a constant struggle. It was at that moment that I decided that although I could not intervene directly beyond my role, I could learn to listen more attentively, with a sensitivity I had not allowed before. I learned to recognize that behind every file, behind every testimony, there were clashes of life that the law does not always manage to contain, but that I had to try to understand. That decision, seemingly simple, changed the way I administered justice forever. The following months showed me that this dual consciousness, the legal and the human, would become the beacon guiding each of my rulings. I saw cases where the facts were clear, but the people were not, where wounds were invisible but present, where the law had to design responses that sought, even timidly, a form of healing. I realized that being a judge also meant learning to live with uncertainty, to understand that the words of codes can become insufficient against the complexity of life. That is why, although some might think justice is an act of certainties and definitive conclusions, I learned that within it dwells a crack that must be accepted, the disconnection between the letter and the soul, between rules and emotions, between reason and compassion. That crack is, paradoxically, what allows justice to be more than a system, that allows it to come closer to being a space where humanity recognizes itself, with its light and its shadows. The most surprising thing of all was when, some time later, I received a letter that brought that case back to my memory with unexpected force. The letter came from the woman who had once crossed the courthouse threshold and spoke to me of her renewed hope. She told me that although the path was still difficult and nothing was resolved, there had been sincere encounters, small but significant steps, that the wound remained open, but something had changed in the way they looked at and listened to each other, starting, of course, with herself and whoever her uncle was. I couldn't get that letter out of my mind, that mixture of gratitude and struggle it contained. I then understood that the justice I had sought to dispense was not a final point, but an invitation to live the complexity of reconciliation. It made me think that perhaps I was finally beginning to approach what it truly means to make justice, not only to enforce the law, but to allow the human encounter to take place in its most authentic form. This experience became a mirror in which I could see the fragility of the human condition reflected in my own life and in those who came to seek me out in the courthouse. It showed me the need to have courage not only to face the relentless force of the law, but also the vulnerability involved in recognizing the humanity of the other. Since then, every sentence, although motivated by reason, I apply with a different listening, with a hope that is not measured in rulings, but in possible lives daring to heal. If you ask me what I learned from that experience, I would tell you something essential, that human justice is, in its essence, a continuous effort to find a fragile balance between objective truth and the tenderness of the soul. Sometimes, that balance slips out of bounds, slides into uncertain zones, and there lies the magic and risk of our work. Because in that unexplored zone there are no easy answers or definitive solutions, but the poetry of the human, with its contradictions, its wounds, and its indomitable capacity to forgive and rebuild. Despite everything, that ruling I made long ago remains for me more than a memory. It is a school, a constant reminder that in life and in law, being right is not enough. We always need compassion, even if it cannot be measured or legislated, because it is compassion that, ultimately, sustains the invisible web that binds us as a society. Sometimes, on nights when the city goes dark and noises silence, I stop to think about them, their stories, that woman and that man, that unexpected witness who changed the course of the trial. I wonder if they finally managed to find a path where justice is not just a ruling but a bridge to something more. And in that question, unanswered, I find the enormous humility that the judicial profession has given me and the certainty that, although not all decisions can be perfect, the attempt to seek that just middle ground between reason and compassion is, perhaps, the truest form of justice we can offer. And so, as life goes on and cases pile up, that lesson remains intact. Because in every face I see crossing the courtroom, in every story intertwined with law and pain, I hear an echo reminding me, time and again, that behind a legal ruling there is always a human story. And that in that encounter lies the mystery and the very humanity of justice. What came after that letter was a succession of small events that, little by little, began to weave a pattern less predictable than I had imagined. Just when I thought that perhaps everything would remain in kind words and fragile promises of change, Life showed me that the story did not end in the courtroom, but continued beating relentlessly in the days and decisions of those people. It was as if that case had left a spark burning in the midst of darkness, and now it depended on each one and on myself, in a way, to shape that flickering light. I received an unexpected message from a social worker who had been working with them, a third party whom I had barely heard in the judicial process until then. She told me that the woman, quiet and resilient, had begun attending family therapy sessions. It was neither easy nor immediate, but she had agreed to put into words the pain that for years had remained buried beneath layers of resentment and fear. The man, on the other hand, was fighting a lonely battle with his demons, still unable to fully let them go, but showing, through gestures insignificant to many, a genuine will to change. They told me that those sessions were an emotional minefield that no one should have to cross alone, yet they did because perhaps they knew it was their only chance to move forward. As I listened to this, my mind recalled every moment of the trial, and the contrast was disconcerting. In the courtroom, everything seemed so rigid, so wrapped in protocols and formalities that true understanding was hindered. But outside that environment, in the fragility of therapy and emotional encounters, the real battle was seen, the one no one decreed, but the most important of all. It struck me to think that my work, despite all its rigor, barely scratched the surface of that ocean of human complexities. And then came an unexpected turn. A different letter, this time from the man, arrived to me through an anonymous email. In it, he confessed his fear, his vulnerability, and a confession that hit me hard. He did not trust that he could fully redeem himself, but he yearned, with all his might, not to be remembered only for his mistakes. He said that many nights he wondered if anyone could ever see him without the weight of his past, without the wounds he had caused completely defining his identity. For a moment, I felt that fragile and genuine voice pierce me beyond the paper on which it was written. This moment was, for me, a turning point. I understood that justice, no matter how hard I tried to apply it with rigor and humanity, would always be incomplete as long as it did not find, or at least acknowledge, that intangible nuance that is repentance and the need for redemption. Perhaps, in those silences and doubts, lay the true essence of forgiveness, a concept that neither law can nor should impose, but that arises from the clean and honest encounter between people willing to be vulnerable and to rebuild. I then decided to take an unconventional path for a judge. I allowed my role as observer, as a person, to intertwine with that case that seemed to want to teach me something deeper than rules. I began to investigate community support groups working on domestic violence and reconciliation, and I became interested in participating in meetings that had been invisible to me from a distance. It was not professional interference, but an act of humanity, an attempt to visualize the whole scenario that the trial had only partially shown. It was in one of those meetings where the complexity of the situation exploded in my face with all its rawness. The woman, with a gaze that no longer sought to hide or show a false strength, spoke of her progress and setbacks. She told how small advances mixed with unexpected crises, and how the shadow of fear still hung over every step she took. She related that sometimes she felt that justice had done nothing but formalize a distance, but that it was she, with a fragile mix of courage and despair, who had to make the leap toward reconstruction. Her story, told aloud, made me see that the line between victim and survivor was thin, and that to move forward it was necessary to honestly acknowledge that duality. In that same meeting, the man appeared. I did not expect him, and seeing him was another blow in that process. The one who had been a withdrawn figure in court now had a different face, marked by repentance, by the search for a new identity beyond error and punishment. He spoke without defenses, with a sincerity that seemed the fruit of long internal work. He admitted his faults without excuses, showed his attempts to change, and yet confessed that shame and fear of rejection were a constant burden. Staying on that path, he said, was perhaps the hardest battle he had ever had. During that encounter, for a moment, I witnessed something much more human than the simple exchange of words. It was as if, in that place full of stories of pain and struggle, an invisible bridge began to be built between two people whom fate had separated for years, and who only now, in the safe space of dialogue and vulnerability, dared to glimpse the possibility of a genuine reunion. But it wasn't all a straight path. Shortly after, news came that shook me deeply. An unexpected setback, an incident that almost seemed to confirm my worst fears, the fragility of that reconstruction process, the difficulty of breaking patterns that are not so easily demolished. I learned there had been a tense encounter, a strong argument in which old wounds reopened, putting at risk the progress they had achieved. It was a brutal reminder that justice, no matter how humane it tries to be, cannot protect people from their own internal battles, nor from the relapses that are part of any deep process of change. That episode confronted me with uncertainty and helplessness, emotions I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge as a judge. It was not cold reason dictating a legal ruling. It was the person who had wanted to believe in the power of change and who now faced the pain of reality, where the path to healing is neither linear nor predictable. In that moment, I knew that justice had to be patient, but also firm in its attempt to offer not only a normative framework, but a foundation for transformation. Since then, one of my greatest challenges has been learning to live with that constant tension, between the hope that the encounter between people holds a real potential to heal, and the unavoidable possibility that the past will always be present, sometimes as a shadow, other times as a latent fire. This experience showed me that the role of justice is more complex than simply issuing sentences. It involves fostering spaces where recognition, dialogue, and understanding can take root, even if sometimes it is on hard and rugged ground. I also realized how important it was not to fall into the trap of thinking that everything depended solely on the people involved. Justice has its place in that web, but not as a distant referee, rather as a companion who must learn to listen, to observe, and also to accept that sometimes there are limits it cannot cross. That does not mean giving up, but acting with humility, knowing that complete answers belong to a much more sensitive and complex terrain. Thus, little by little, I came to understand that the sentence itself had been only the first step, a necessary and tangible act, but that the true challenge lay in what came after, in the emotional reconstruction, in the attempt to restore to people a sense of dignity and belonging that transcends letters and official seals. This learning became a silent beacon in my path, a guide to walk with more empathy and fewer rigid certainties. What impressed me most was seeing how, despite the difficulties, that couple kept trying. They did not do it because someone demanded it of them, nor because the law required it, but for something deeper, a genuine, though wounded, desire for reconciliation. It is in that small act of courage where I found, perhaps, the greatest meaning of my work. What began as just another case had transformed into a living lesson about the fragility and strength of the human, about the unavoidable need for compassion, and, above all, about the eternal struggle of balancing reason with the soul. No matter how much the law can offer answers, true justice will always be in those moments when people are allowed to meet, to listen to each other, and, despite fear and distance, dare to begin to heal. Thinking about all this leads me to one last reflection. Justice is not a single act nor a definitive result, but a living process that extends beyond the sentence, that is tinged with contradictions and hopes, and that is built in that invisible space where hearts dare to beat together, even after the trial. In that space, justice can cease to be cold to become something great, complex, and deeply human. And in that certainty, perhaps, lies its greatest power. The months following that setback were such unstable ground that it seemed impossible to find a firm step to hold on to. The couple, who had so arduously begun to build something beyond the shadows of their pasts, once again faced profound emotional exhaustion. I cannot deny that I felt a mixture of frustration and compassion hitting me like an unexpected blow. Every time I received news or updates, I held onto fragile hope while simultaneously aware that this path was riddled with uncertainties. It was not justice that dictated the next step, but the sometimes fragile will of two people trying to rebuild themselves and the bond they had allowed to survive. The hardest part was understanding, without giving in to despair, that there would be no straight line to redemption nor an infallible formula for reconciliation. Each advance was accompanied by a setback. Every gesture of openness served to reveal wounds that still bled and yet demanded to be acknowledged. It was in those moments that the distance between the law and life grew larger, and I understood even more the human dimension that justice seemed incapable of fully encompassing. That day in the support group, I felt it particularly. The woman, her voice breaking, confessed that she had felt the entire judicial process was like a broken mirror, reflecting only fragments of her pain, but never its entirety. Her words resonated with brutal honesty and showed me that the wound was not only physical or visible, but penetrated to the deepest part of the being. On the other hand, the man explained how the fear of being rejected or worse, failing again, had almost paralyzed him. He recounted how he had come to question every one of his moves, fearing that a single mistake would be enough to condemn him to loneliness and oblivion. It was an almost sacred moment in which vulnerability made that small circle a kind of refuge where hope seemed, at last, able to breathe. However, after that meeting there was a silence that unsettled me. Never before had I been so deeply immersed in a case, nor had I felt so clearly that weight in my chest between surrender and possibility. Then I received a message from the social worker. The couple had had a serious fight. Not only that, the woman had nearly abandoned therapy, and the man seemed to be questioning his ability to continue with the change. As I read those lines, I knew that incident was a trial by fire for all that had been built, and also a painful reflection of what so many people face when trying to break free from a cycle that not only hurts, but is embedded deep within themselves. Despite the blow, I did not give up, nor did this story seem destined to end that way. I knew justice should not be limited to imposing punishments or reparations, but had to be understood as a tool, a starting point for more complex and long-term processes. I drew even closer to the professionals supporting the couple and participated in meetings where strategies were developed, boundaries and expectations were discussed, and small achievements were celebrated. There I learned that behind every advance, there was always an invisible network of support made of patience, understanding, and above all, humanity. It was in one of those meetings that I saw something that still moves me when I remember it. The woman, with tears in her eyes, recounted an unexpectedly good day. She had managed to express her deepest fear without fear, and the man, instead of responding with irritation or silence, accompanied her. It was a moment that seemed so simple, but contained an entire universe. The mutual recognition, without masks or defenses, opened a door that until then seemed locked tight. I realized that this, more than any sentence or rule, was the true miracle that the law could not dictate, the free and courageous act of building a new bond from the ashes of the former one. The next day, I received a new letter from the man. This time, he had abandoned formality and fear of being judged. His words were humble and honest. He confessed he was not a perfect man, nor sought to be, but was willing to face each day with the courage he had left. He said he wanted to be remembered not for his mistakes, but for his struggle to be better. Reading that message, I felt a strange relief mixed with deep sadness. No one can erase their past, but they can choose what to do with it from that moment on. And there lay the key, in the continuous bet on hope, on reconciliation with oneself and with others. However, despite all the beauty and fragility that had begun to be built, reality once again reminded us of its harshness. One afternoon, just a few weeks after that letter, the woman was hospitalized after an intense emotional crisis caused by accumulated anxiety and stress. I received the news with a lump in my throat and the latent anguish of knowing the path remained tortuous and that healing processes could dangerously falter at any moment. At that instant, I wondered how many times one could try to rise without exhaustion or fear defeating us. But something also became clear to me, the importance of not giving up. Resilience, more than a word, is the daily act of continuing to fight when everything seems to conspire to surrender. After several days of treatment, the woman returned to the support group with a renewed decision to carry on, despite fatigue and doubts. Seeing her return was another one of those moments that showed me justice is imperfect because it is human, because it faces lives not made to fit into molds or deadlines. For my part, this case transformed me. I began to question more and more my role as a judge and as a human being, and to understand that the most unforgettable sentence was neither the final document nor the legal arguments weighing on the scales, but all that invisible web of emotions, fears, struggles, and small victories that took place long after the courtroom lights went out. Justice cannot look away, nor be limited to applying the law. It must be present, even at a distance, accompanying those complex and unique healing processes. Thus, little by little, I learned to view the law from a new perspective, one that incorporates compassion without weakening reason, that recognizes the inherent imperfection of the human condition and values effort beyond the result. I understood that justice is much more than a verdict. It is the possibility of offering a beacon in the darkness for those sailing stormy seas, a space where seeds can be sown that take time to germinate, but which, with care and time, can transform lives. Now, when I face a case, I no longer see only facts and laws. I see people with their silences, contradictions, and desires. I know sentences can open doors, but also that true revolutions are born in those small and often invisible spaces where human beings dare to face their own demons and seek something better. That is why I keep that case in my memory with a mixture of melancholy and hope, as a constant reminder that justice, though imperfect, has the capacity to be deeply human. And although the past always leaves marks, and although healing is not a straight line nor a path illuminated by certainties, that encounter, that attempt at reconciliation beyond the law, taught me that true justice is not written only in court records, but in the brave decision of each person to try again, despite the fear. Because it is there, in that space where reason embraces compassion, that the most authentic and powerful essence of the human being resides. That was my most unforgettable sentence, and the legacy I carry with me every time I enter the courtroom with the intention of doing justice, not only with the law but with the soul. That episode made me remember that no commitment to justice, no matter how well-founded and rigorous, can be sustained without a deep understanding of the ground on which it stands, the complex and sometimes hostile geography of the human condition. But I also understood that, painful as setbacks may be, there is always room for a new attempt. The fragility of the process, far from being a sign of failure, is itself proof that true transformation does not arise from force, but from persistence and patience. As the weeks went by, the couple continued facing those invisible challenges that most people are unaware of, those moments when the mind and heart seem to wage separate battles and every day is a silent conquest. I began receiving reports detailing small victories, gestures that revealed fear but at the same time showed a glimpse of hope, a phone call at an agreed time, a therapy session despite exhaustion, an attempt at dialogue when everything invited silence. In one of those reports, the social worker told me how both had started writing a sort of shared diary, where they expressed without filters what they felt and feared. That practice was more than therapy, it was a bridge built with words that allowed them to hold on when it seemed the abyss was lurking too close. I was surprised, however, that as he and she progressed toward that fragile balance, new cracks appeared, not as visible or dramatic as before, but perhaps more dangerous because of their subtlety. The woman began to show signs of growing anxiety disguised as extreme tiredness, and the man, although committed, started to reveal silent weariness, as if the constant struggle was a burden heavier than he had anticipated. It was then that I fully understood that justice cannot be limited to hearing only the stories presented in court. It must be able to ask what happens outside those walls where stories continue, often without spectators, applause, or attention. In the midst of that process, another event shook me deeply. I received an unexpected call from the man. His voice, which had previously sounded confident, now had a broken, almost fragile tone. He confessed that although he remained committed to change, the weight of guilt and shame sometimes paralyzed him, that there were nights when he wondered if he truly deserved a different future. Those words, charged with a vulnerability granted only in intimacy, made me see the case with new clarity. Beyond law and justice, behind every person who knocks on the court's door is a human being fighting their own demons, often invisible to the outside eye. It was at that moment that I decided my role had to go beyond the traditional function of a judge. I contacted specialists and proposed a closer, more human interdisciplinary approach that considered not only the facts, but also the internal emotional process. Justice could not remain static or rigid if it wanted to fulfill its true mission. This shift in perspective, though invisible to some, was the seed that would allow support for the couple to be sustained not only from legality, but from active compassion, from building a space where both could feel less alone. Time went on, and with it, fluctuations in the relationship continued to appear, now with the emergence of new feelings that were hard to name but marked the path: fear of falling again, wounded pride, a deep desire for belonging. There were bright days when hope seemed an unbeatable beacon, and dark nights when exhaustion and doubt threatened to extinguish it for good. In those ups and downs, I saw myself reflected as never before in my profession, that thin line between the firmness demanded by the law and the tenderness life requires, that precarious balance where true justice lies. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I recognized that an unexpected turning point had arrived. The couple, for the first time, had managed to express their fears and frustrations together in a joint session, without resorting to accusations or automatic defenses, but from a place of mutual respect and authentic openness. I was moved by how that small act represented a gigantic leap. They had begun to recognize each other not only as victims or aggressors, not only as subjects of judgment or punishment, but as human beings in process, with the real capacity to build a different future. That was perhaps the greatest confirmation for me, the evidence that justice finds its meaning when those human stories are treated with depth and respect. However, as often happens in real life, joy had its counterpoint. A new conflict emerged, this time not a product of past wounds, but of the difficulty of accepting present imperfections. Living together, with its daily challenges, revealed accumulated tensions that tested not only the couple's will but also the limits of my own understanding as a judge. To what extent could I intervene without invading that delicate process? Where was the boundary between justice and intrusion? Questions that anticipate impossible answers, which only time and patience can help clarify. At one of the most critical moments, I received a letter from the woman that would leave an unforgettable mark on me. In her lines was a mixture of exhaustion and hope, fear and courage, revealing a soul willing to keep moving forward despite everything. "I am not perfect," she wrote, "nor do I expect to be fully understood. I just want you to know that every day is a battle and that although sometimes I fall, I get up again and again because I want to believe I deserve a better future. Not just for me, but for us." Those words hit me like a shock, reminding me of the power of human will and the urgent need for justice to accompany it, to protect it, to propel it. That case showed me, without a doubt, that justice is a living force that cannot be boxed into protocols or the idea of immediate results. It is a continuous process, sometimes arid, lit by fleeting moments of understanding and tenderness. Beyond the robe and the rulings, I learned that true justice must also be an act of humanity, a constant commitment to the individuals who come seeking redress and who fight, inwardly, battles that the law cannot and should not ignore. Closing that chapter in my mind, I was left with a deep certainty. The power of justice does not lie solely in the rigorous application of rules, but in the capacity to accompany human processes with compassion and perseverance. That every person, even when their path is marked by shadows, has the opportunity to be heard, understood, and supported. That justice, in its purest essence, is a beacon that illuminates not only rules but also hearts. And although that couple story continues, like many others that pass through the halls of courts, I know that from that first ruling to today, many things have happened that do not appear in case files or records. Invisible miracles have occurred, silent gestures, brave decisions that give real meaning to justice. Precisely for that reason, when I enter the courtroom, I now carry with me that essential lesson, that the true sentence is not the one I decree, but the one each person dares to write with their life, their efforts, their pain, and, above all, their hope. Because there, in that intangible place where reason embraces compassion, lies the essence of what it truly means to do justice.